In the Bible, we're told to be still and know that I am God. Our next speaker has as her subject the healing power of stillness, and she'll expand on that quality of getting yourself quiet so that you can hear the truth. I'd like to introduce to you Larissa Snorek Yates from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who is Massachusetts. Oh, where did I get Pennsylvania? Okay. And remind everyone, full bios are out on the website, talksthatinspire.org or .com, take your pick. So, Larissa, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Hi. There is a Carlisle, Pennsylvania as well. And anyway, I live outside of Boston, Massachusetts, so that's where I'm from. And as you may have heard earlier, I work full-time as a healing practitioner of Christian Science, as my colleagues do as well, that you heard earlier. And I grew up in a Christian Science household where I had a mom where her first response to any problems, whether they were physical or social or emotional, was prayer. But I never imagined I would be here with you today. I never imagined I would be full-time in religious work at all. I studied peace building and conflict resolution, and then went into international development, and then taught graduate school, and finally backed into this work. But what I have discovered is that it is my first love to just see people growing spiritually and finding peace and healing in their lives. So I'm just delighted to be here with you all today in California, and with all of you joining us from around the world on the web. So why stillness? Well, friends who've known me for a really long time, if they were here, they might tell you that they know me to be a person who moves fast and thinks fast and always has about 100 things on her plate going all at one time. And so stillness is actually quite important for me in my life. I have found that the more things I have to do on any given day, the more time I need to do nothing. I just pause and find a connection with that sense of stillness, and that sustains me and keeps me approaching whatever I have to do from that place of being still within. And you're going to hear a little bit later about how that's helped me in my life. But this sense of stillness we're talking about isn't necessarily about sitting still or about pausing, although that can help. But it's a stillness that's mental, that's in our hearts. It's finding the quiet within our consciousness that allows us to feel connected to the divine. And I'm going to start with a story that inspired me that I think has to do with stillness, and it's about a cellist. So we're going to go back in time a little bit to 1992 into the center square of Sarajevo. And this man approaches the square and he plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case. He takes out the cello and he starts to play. And as the sound of the beautiful instrument kind of fills the square, behind him, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. Now, this is a rather unconventional approach. You see a war beginning, and so you go out into the middle of it to play an instrument, right? And he didn't just do this one time, but he went back for 22 consecutive days into Sarajevo to play music, to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed at the start of the war while standing in a bread line. Now, when I heard this story, it got me asking myself, what would it take? What kind of peace within yourself would you need to go into the middle of that kind of a war zone? Now, that may not apply to those of us here today or many of you on the web, but it begs us to ask the question that whatever it is in your lives, in our lives, that's bombarding us mentally, right, in our thoughts, whatever it may be, whether it's something personal we're dealing with, or a relationship challenge, or just world events that are bombarding us constantly in the news or in our Facebook feed or whatever, wherever you get your news from. Whatever seems to be bombarding us mentally, can we do the same thing? Can we approach it from a place of stillness from within? So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, this quote from a woman named Pam Brown kind of helps us think about stillness. She says, "At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace. a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here, in this stillness, is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. So let's just unpack this briefly for a moment. So we're talking about a stillness that's within our own hearts. We don't have to go to some beautiful, we're in Lake Tahoe, right? It's beautiful here. So we don't have to come to South Lake Tahoe to find stillness. We don't have to go up into the mountains. We don't have to escape from our daily environment. That the stillness we're searching for, the sense of peace with ourselves, you already have it inside of you, every one of you. It's something that's so deep within us that the loss of someone we love, the challenges of our life, whatever we might have gone through, changes we didn't expect, none of that can touch or remove that stillness. It might hide it sometimes, right? Like the clouds kind of obscure the sun, but it never leaves. And it's not touched by the things in our lives that happen to us outside of us. So I have an analogy that helps me think about this concept of stillness. And it has to do with instruments. Again, violins and a cello. You can see a cello on your screen. And my son has been playing cello for 14 years, I believe, at this point. And every time he would sit down to play his cello or go into his cello lesson, do you guys know what the first thing you have to do is if you play an instrument? You have to tune it, right? Because otherwise you don't want to listen to it. So when you tune a violin or a cello, one way to do it is to turn on a little tuner, an instrument, a little machine tuner, and it plays a pure, perfect tone. And then you start to play the instrument, and inevitably it's out of tune, and you hear the dissonance. You can feel that it's out of sync, that you're not lined up with that perfect tone. But then, as you turn the fine-tuning knobs, those little black knobs at the bottom of the cello, as you turn those ever so slightly, the instrument comes into line with that pure, perfect tone. And if you close your eyes while this is happening, it sounds like there's only one sound being played. And that oneness, that alignment, is what stillness feels like for me. That we're aligning ourselves with the divine, with God, with divine love. God as this divine ever-presence, not a personified image of someone somewhere far away, but the ever-presence of love right in front of us. We're tuning in to this divine goodness in our lives. And when we feel completely in sync with that divine goodness, it's like there's no separation between us and God. We feel like we are the outcome of God. And so the task of life for me and the practice of stillness is getting ourselves tuned up, continually fine-tuning our lives to sync ourselves with that divine goodness. And that's, a daily, constant, moment-by-moment activity. But Mary Baker Eddy, who you've been hearing about today, she was the founder of Christian Science, which is informing everything you're going to hear from me today. Comes from the Bible and the book Science and Health that she wrote. And she said this, she said, keep your violin in tune. And what she meant by this was that sense of keeping yourself as sort of that violin, tuning yourself into God on a regular, daily basis. And that, for me, is what stillness is all about. So we have two keynote ideas for today. The first one you heard, actually, Joe mentioned it. Be still and know that I am God. It comes from Psalms 46. You actually heard from Dave earlier, if you tuned into his talk, the beginning of Psalms 46, that God is a very present help in trouble. And at the end of that very short psalm, after all this turbulence happens and the mountains are falling into the sea and the rivers are being disrupted, it says this little phrase, be still and know that I am God. Now the question, so with these religious teachings from the Bible, which is what Christian Science is based on, the question often in studying Christianity and studying the Bible, Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science, she wanted to know how to put those things into practice, which is the spirituality aspect of religion, right? So the Bible gives us sort of the religious ideals, the religious vision for life. The Science and Health book sort of gives us the how-to, how to put that into practice, the spiritual practice on a daily basis of the ideas in the Bible. So this is what Mary Baker Eddy said in terms of one way to do this, to get still and know that I am God. She said that we hear God when our senses are silent. Okay, so our 5 senses. When we quiet the thoughts that are racing in our heads, when we're not focused on what we see or what we're hearing or what we're thinking about so much, but all of those thoughts go quiet, that's when we hear Spirit or the voice of God. And we're going to talk more about that as we go today. So we have 3 parts we're going to cover. The first one is to look at practicing stillness in our lives for ourselves. How do we find peace with ourselves, and what does that look like? Then we're going to look a little bit at, well, how can we find peace with other people in our relationships? How do we resolve conflicts, personal relationship conflicts? How can we practice stillness when we're tempted to react to someone else? And then the third part is going to be looking at the world. When we are really drawn into getting agitated or upset or kind of feeling at odds with what's happening in the world, how can we bring that sense of stillness to whatever it is that we're hearing out there? So those are the 3 places we're going, the 3 steps where we're headed. So to start off, part 1, looking at how we can be at peace with ourselves. All right, so we're just going to do a little exercise here, and you can do this with us on the web, all right? So we're just going to take like 12 seconds. And I know you're all sitting down, and I know I said stillness does not require you to be physically still, but today we're going to just be still. We're going to close our eyes, and we're just going to take 12 seconds to just fine-tune ourselves a little bit to that sense of stillness. And then I'm going to ask you what it looks like for you to be at peace with yourself. Okay, so 12 seconds, go. Okay, come back together. Wasn't that glorious? It was so quiet. All right, so that was brief, but stillness doesn't take a lot of time. You don't have to, again, go somewhere else. You can be in your car, in traffic. Don't close your eyes if you're driving. But, you don't have to close your eyes, but you can just find that place of stillness wherever you are, in the middle of the busiest day that you're dealing with. So the key for me in practicing being still is to know what it looks like to be at peace with myself. What is the goal, right? It's not just an emptying out of all of our thoughts. That might be a first step, but what's after that, right? Once we get our thoughts quiet and our senses quiet, then what? Well, for me, it's filling up with this sense of what it looks like to be at peace. So just shout out a couple of things, and I'll repeat it so it gets recorded. But for you, what characterizes being at peace with yourself? Just shout out some ideas.
Satisfied.
Feeling satisfied. Okay, great. Excellent. What else? Calm, right? Feeling a sense of joy. Okay, a sense of joy that maybe, to me, is not necessarily tethered or attached to sort of, getting a new boyfriend or girlfriend, or suddenly earning getting a big check in the mail, or whatever it is. It's not necessarily attached to outside circumstances. It's finding that joy that exists within our own hearts, where we find ourselves just smiling for no reason at people on the street. We just feel that sort of overflowing sense of joy. Good, what else? A couple others.
Peace.
Feeling at peace. What is it? But what characterizes that peace for you? Anything particular?
No more worries.
No more worries, right? Exactly. So when you're feeling at peace, you're not thinking about worries, right? You're not worried about things or concerned. What else? There was another one. Yeah.
Receptive.
Receptive? Yes. So we feel receptive. We feel open, right? We're not closing ourselves off and kind of from the world, but we feel open and receptive to other people, to connections with others and connections with nature. There's a sense of openness. Good. A couple more. There were some over here.
Now.
Living in the now. Thank you. That relates back to Dave's talk earlier, right? Living in the present moment. That we're not ruminating about something that happened in the past, and we're not overly focused on what's going to happen in the future, right? We're just in the present moment, and we're just loving that moment, loving our life. It gives us permission to love our lives, to not miss those beautiful moments in the present. Excellent. Anything else that anyone was burning to say? Gratitude? Contentment. What else?
No pain.
No pain. That in stillness, we don't feel the pain of our lives. Maybe that's where we connect with that divine presence, and we're not so conscious of the pain. All right, so if you had other ones, or on the web, if you were thinking of some, note them down. They're important for you to pay attention to. So let's just see if we missed any that I had here. focusing on the present. Oh, that for me, being at peace with myself means, I'm just not so interested in judging others or myself harshly. It's just not interesting anymore. I'm not interested in conflict, in perpetuating, going over the conflicts of my life or, ruminating and kind of analyzing what might have happened. It's no longer interesting. You feel really at peace with where you are. You're not worrying. There's gratitude, appreciation that just overflows. It's natural. You feel connected. Oh, and then this last one is so key. It's key for our next piece here. Feeling at peace for me means we're willing to let things unfold in our lives rather than having to make them happen. So it takes us away from feeling like we're in charge, like we're the movers and shakers of our lives, right? That we're willing to let things unfold and watch them happen rather than feeling like we have to be in charge all the time. All right, so this is just the list that we made together and the list that's on the screen right now. The reason, to me, this is important is because when we're practicing being still, we're connecting with this vision, this ideal, this reality of our being, that all of us have this ability to live this way. And this is that fine-tuning, is just tuning ourselves in to that sense of peace that is deep within us already. It's a discovery of it. It's not creating peace. It's not creating the stillness. It's not trying to get somewhere, trying to earn our ability to be at peace. It's discovering that it's already at the heart of each one of us, of our true nature. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a brief story of how this has been helpful for me. So it was a time in my life where I was feeling an incredible amount of stress and tension and pressure with workload and things with my kids. I have 2 children, and things in my healing practice, and I had a huge load of patients at the time. And so I woke up one morning, and I had been kind of feeling this stress sort of creep in, but hadn't really been noticing it too much or kind of paying attention. And I woke up and I hadn't slept very well, and I had a really stiff neck. And I had kind of had this problem periodically throughout my life. And so I woke up and, oh, here we go again, was one of my first thoughts. I'm embarrassed to admit. Shouldn't be my first thought. As I mentioned, I grew up in a household where prayer was sort of the first response, right? So I did begin by engaging in prayer, and I was really wanting to connect with God and with that true sense of my spiritual being. But I was a bit distracted by my to-do list, which was like, felt like it was out the door. So I prayed a bit, but I was sort of falling into the trap of praying in a way as if, again, I was kind of in charge of my life, right? And I had all this stuff to do, and I was having this incredible pain in my neck, and so I needed God to kind of come down from wherever, God is, whatever, right? This is how I was sort of thinking, and kind of help me out, right? Fix me so that I could kind of go on my day. Okay, now this is not prayer in Christian Science, okay? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was kind of like that. It was like I was the CEO, right? And God was like my second in charge, right? So anyway, needless to say, I went throughout my day, kind of hoping God would bring me some healing right here, right? Nothing changed. The second day, again, nothing had changed. The pain was a bit more intense. And by the end of that second day, I went to bed and was just so miserable. And I woke up the third day completely immobile. I mean, taking a step would send these shooting pains up my neck in the back of my head. So at this point, I had to sit still. I couldn't move. It was intense. The pain was absolutely too intense and excruciating. And so as I was forced to kind of physically be still, I started to focus on the prayer that I knew growing up that I had kind of forgotten about, the listening part of prayer, right? So the first time I went to Africa, I used to travel a lot for work in Africa, still do a little bit. Anyway, someone told me this parable, and they said, Laurie, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, God gave us these things for a reason. And the point was to listen twice as much as we talk, right? So this is great for prayer, right? So I had kind of been talking at God, like, this is what I need, right? Are you hearing me? And this third day, I just realized, wait a second, I'm supposed to be listening twice as much as I talk to God about the problems and what I need. So as I got really still, and I started to do what Mary Baker Eddy talked about, just quieting the senses, right? And as I started to get really quiet, and the pain was a little bit distracting, so sometimes it would pull me down into the distraction of the pain, but as I really was focusing on that stillness, I heard a clear message that said, I am the shepherd. Now, I had not been thinking about shepherds or sheep, and to me, this is the way we hear God. This is the way we hear divine inspiration. That it comes to us without us consciously thinking about it. It comes as an inspired thought, and it takes us in a new direction, which is what happened to me. So I'm in bed, I'm sitting there trying to avoid thinking about the pain, and I think about this idea of the shepherd, and I think, at first I'm sort of arguing a little bit with the thought, because I felt like, well, I'm shepherding my kids and my household and my projects and my patients and my life in general. What do you mean you're the shepherd, God? So as I thought about it, I realized that meant that I was a sheep. And then I realized I really didn't like the sheep. Right? Because sheep get kind of a bad rap, right? They're followers. They're sort of, you grow up, I grew up in Western society here in America, and my thought was like, I don't want to be a follower, a blind follower. We want to be leaders and kind of in charge and so forth. And so you don't want to admire the sheep, right? But I figured, okay, this was a divine message. I'm going to figure out what it is about the sheep that I need to understand. So just briefly, what are the qualities of the sheep? If you think about God as the shepherd and the sheep are following the shepherd, what qualities do sheep represent to you guys? Meekness, gentleness, trust. They listen. What else did I miss? Innocence. Docile, they obey, right? Obedience, exactly. There was another one over here. The follow, right? They follow willingly, right? They trust. You know that sheep will not drink if the water is moving? Did you guys know this? This is fascinating to me. So they have to be led to the still waters, right? Like Psalm 23 says. So they trust that shepherd. Another one that I don't know if anyone mentioned here, but someone recently who went to Ireland and met with like an actual shepherd, a modern day shepherd, told me this story that they got to the sheepfold with the actual shepherd in the car, and there were like 3 sheep here and like 2 sheep over there and like a couple sheep up on the hill. And the guy was not that impressed. He's like, there's not that many sheep here, right? But then the shepherd called the sheep. And like 250 sheep came running, right in front of this shepherd, because they knew that voice. They knew their shepherd's voice so well that they would respond, be obedient, they would follow, they would come. And that was what got me, was this idea of knowing the shepherd's voice louder than I know my own voice. That I wanted to understand God's plan for my day on a daily basis. I realized that was my deepest desire, more than wanting the pain to go away, although that was a desire. But more than that was really wanting to understand my whole life in context of God at the center, as opposed to me at the center. And this was a huge shift in thought for me. That rather than feeling like, I'm the mover and shaker of what happens in my life, I wanted to be receptive to what God was doing. And it shifted my morning prayer from, okay, God, I have a lot of things to do. I hope you're here with me, right? To waking up and just saying, God, this is your day. What do you want me to do with it today? That someone mentioned receptivity earlier, right? That receptivity to what God is doing. That for me involves the stillness for me is about going deeper than the problems we're trying to solve. Sometimes, in Western society, we are so good at problem solving, right? We're taught from like a tiny age. All my kids in school, they all learned, it's a great skill to learn to problem solve. You learn it in math, you learn it in how you write an essay, etc. But with prayer in Christian Science, it's not a problem-solving method. It's not about identifying the problem and kind of working through steps to the conclusion. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. You have to get the vision of the conclusion first. And the vision of the conclusion is our divine relationship to God, our understanding of our identity in spirit as the highest goal. The result of that understanding is that it changes our physical bodies, it changes our emotional state, it changes the way we feel on a daily basis, but that's not the original goal. It's not to problem solve something, but to understand more about divine reality based on certain laws of God, laws that Christ Jesus came to teach us about. Just like the laws of the movement of the solar system, for example. So Our senses will always trick us. If we are looking out at the sun, at the horizon line at sunset, it looks like the sun is sinking down below the horizon. That is what our eyes will tell us. That is what we see with our senses. But we know from understanding the movement of the planets, that's not what is going on. But there is nothing physical that will tell us that, because we don't feel the movement of our planet, right? So it's the same with divine law. Divine laws are not seen physically. They're felt spiritually. But they undergird all of our existence, everyone's existence. And those laws are what Jesus came to teach us about. And that's what we're aligning ourselves with in prayer when we're listening. So as I was pondering the sheep and thinking about the shepherd and moving beyond the goal of losing the pain and really understanding my relationship with God at the center, my whole body relaxed. I stopped worrying about if the pain would go away. I stopped being anxious about all the stuff I was missing and not getting done. The stress left, and I just felt this incredible, deep, settled calm. It was as quiet as in this room, right, in my thoughts. It was so quiet and peaceful, and that was when everything in my neck and my head just loosened up. And this kind of transformation of the body, this kind of healing work, is not so much about something we do with our human mind. It's really about putting our thoughts aside and yielding to the divine law that's out there. And that's when we realize that reality of healing, the reality that was always there, and we align ourselves with it. So being at peace, finding that sense of stillness. So this is just a little funny thing that I found recently, and it's a joke. It says, "You can't unfollow me, I'm your shepherd." Right? I love this. I love this quote. And you've got the sheep on his cell phone, right? So, what I love about it is that you can't disconnect from the shepherd, the divine shepherd, that God is always shepherding us. Divine love shepherds every single one of us. And as we align ourselves with that shepherd, we are better CEOs. We are better directors of organizations. We are better parents. We are better spouses. We are better at shepherding the things in our lives when we understand our divine sense of shepherding. So this is an idea from Mary Baker Eddy that I feel like concludes for me just this sense of finding peace with ourselves, practicing being still. It can just take a moment of your day, in the middle of your workday, by just remembering before you walk into a meeting to get yourself calm and still. It can make such a difference. Mary Baker Eddy said this. She wrote, "There is a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep, settled calm." That's what we want to discover in stillness. All right, so part 2. How does this apply to relationships with other people? There's a relationship with ourselves, right? But then, gosh, how do we be still when someone's just really, they're doing that thing again that I wish they wouldn't do, right? Or they said they treated me badly again, and I just don't stand it anymore, right? So what is it that we can do to maintain that sense of stillness? Well, this is also from the Psalms, be still and seek God, okay? So how do we seek God in those moments where we're tempted to react to other people in life? Well, the thing that has helped me so much is something that Paul wrote repeatedly in all of his writings and all of his letters that he wrote to the Thessalonians and the Corinthians and the Philippians, etc. He said in many different ways, you all have the mind of Christ. Now, what is this idea of Christ? You've been hearing about it a little bit today. I think of the Christ as sort of an irresistible divine influence that operates on everyone's behalf. It doesn't matter what your religion is or your background or what you know about God, really. And that there's this little space right before we're about to react to someone else in life. There's like a little space. And that's where the Christ enters. Okay? And it's like it keeps us from reacting the way we've always reacted. It gives us a new thought to think. And it's this divine influence that brings goodness to our lives in a practical sense. All right, so how does this work? So just a brief story. I have 2 younger sisters, and I mentioned I have 2 children. And I love my sisters dearly. And one of my sisters has never had any kids. And when I was a new mom, she used to love to come over to my house. She's a wonderful aunt. But she also really enjoyed giving me parenting advice. Now, I mentioned she has no kids, right? Okay. So I would find this rather annoying at first, and so what would happen is she would see something that happened and she would, give her advice, and I would kind of react with sort of defensiveness about what I was doing and whatever, or my whole theory about parenting that I thought was quite, justified, et cetera. And, there was some tension and et cetera. And, we'd kind of go off our separate ways after a few minutes and kind of leave the subject. And this kept happening every time she'd come over. So one day I found myself, after a couple of years of this, she was coming over and I thought, this is not, I was studying peace building at the time, right? Being peaceful, right? Okay. So I was really asking myself how I could maintain that sense of peace in relationship to my sister. And this is the idea that was so helpful to me, was this mind of Christ thing. But the mind of Christ, again, it's that divine influence that comes not from our conscious thoughts, but it's irresistible. It interrupts our thought process and gives us something new to think about. So I reasoned that if I was going to be receptive to that Christ influence, then that was going to be the only influence between my sister and I. And I was going to listen to that voice louder than my sister's voice and see what happened, right? So my sister comes over, same story, right? Something happens with my kids, and she's, giving some new parenting advice. But instead of immediately responding, I could feel my body kind of tensing up to react. But I thought, no, what is the Christ idea that I can see in her? And immediately some thought came to me that was rather ridiculous, and we ended up laughing about it. It was just some good-humored thing that I said. And it surprised me in a way. And it relaxed the tension, and we both laughed about it. And then we just moved on, and she stopped, giving me advice at that point. And I was so amazed. I thought, well, that's the Christ. When we're receptive to it, it gives us those inspired thoughts that change the dialogue, that transition the conversation. And it didn't go back to that. In fact, her advice actually is pretty good. She's, I discovered later on. So that in these relationships where we are tempted to feel like we live in these, I don't know if you know these ball pits that children go into, right? There's these, at circuses and fairs in America at least, there's these colorful ball pits with these really light balls, and these kids will jump in and the ball's like popcorn everywhere, and more kids get in, and it's just reaction, it's so chaotic to watch, and everything's going everywhere and you can't keep track of it all, and that's what it can feel like to be in relationship at times. But this mind of Christ idea gives us a sense of how to stop feeling like we are living in reaction to others. So let's just break this down again for a minute. So for those of you that think about the Christ idea, again, this is the spirit that Jesus embodied, the divine spirit that he was in tune with constantly, that he showed us through his works. What does it look like for you? What does it mean to have the mind of Christ? We talked about not reacting. What else does it mean? Just throw out some ideas. What does it mean to you guys here? Having a sense of humility, right? Really being receptive and humble. Yes, someone else? Love. Okay, love for all humanity, right? A sense of love that's so compassionate, that sees beyond people's behavior. That someone can be behaving badly. There's a story in the Bible about Jesus coming to Jericho, with his disciples, and of course a crowd is following him like they always do in the Bible, right? And so he gets to Jericho, and Bartimaeus, this blind guy, is on the side of the road. And Bartimaeus sees Jesus, and he wants to be healed of his blindness, so he starts calling out to Jesus to come help him. Well, the disciples, I don't know what Jesus' mission was exactly this day, but the disciples are thinking, no, he's got to be quiet. So they start telling him to shut up, be quiet, calm down. And the more that they tell Bartimaeus to be quiet, the more he yells louder. You can imagine the scene, right? Just noise and people shouting. And what does Jesus do? Well, the Bible says Jesus stood still. Now, I asked myself the question, why didn't Jesus just run over to Bartimaeus and heal the guy, right? I mean, it would have stopped all the chaos immediately, right? But that's not what it says. It says he stood still. And I forget what someone mentioned that got me on this tangent, but the sense of standing still. And then, of course, he goes and heals Bartimaeus, right? So that was the result. But this idea of being still first, because I know what it was, that he wasn't looking at the picture in the same way the disciples were. He was seeing deeper than the immediate picture, than the behavior of the people in the room. So having the mind of Christ, that we bring compassion and love, that we bring stillness to whatever we do, that there's a sense, I think someone mentioned humility, which equals a sense of equality. Right? Jesus did not like superiority. He never felt superior to other people, even though he, of all people, to me at least, was most justified in feeling superior. Right? But he put that down, that sense of superiority. He welcomed children to come to him. That the mind of Christ keeps us God-centered, that there's a oneness with divine presence that doesn't assert ego. And finally, that thoughts about others come from God. And this is what helps us in this reaction idea, that my thoughts about my sister didn't have to come from what she said to me. They could come from what God was telling me about her. And that changes the conversation. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you another brief healing story. It's from a friend of mine. And she also grew up in a Christian Science home where she turned to prayer first thing throughout her life. And this particular day, as an adult, she woke up and she had a rash covering her arms and her hands and her legs and her feet. And like she has done all her life, she started off in prayer, and she was really trying to align her thoughts with that sense of her divine identity, to connect with God. But what was happening is she was getting distracted by the itchiness. It was really agitating. And so she really was trying to replace the idea of irritation of all kinds with thoughts about God, but she was getting very distracted. She practiced being grateful for many things, but the itchiness kept coming in. So she called her sister, who was also a practicing Christian Scientist, and asked for prayer help. And her sister was very helpful and loving. And she felt a bit better after the phone call, was a little less worried. And then she went and was talking with her husband during the day, and her husband is an open-minded agnostic, right, who's very supportive of her spiritual practices for health. But he was also really curious about this, and he's looking at his wife, and he says, well, now, maybe it's an allergic reaction. Or, gosh, do you think it's something, do you think you got into poison ivy? Or are you really stressed? Are you having a stress reaction? But my friend was not looking for a physical reason for the rash. She wanted to go deeper and understand and get a spiritual insight about her relationship to God, about the divine. That's what she was looking for. So she thought about this for a while, and then she fell asleep. She woke up many hours later, and now it was nighttime, and nothing had changed. She was very agitated, and she was getting worried now, even more worried than she had been. She calls her sister again, and her sister says to her a few things, and then she says, well, just lose all your anxiousness. And so my friend thinks, well, that's probably a good thing to do, but I don't know. This is a really tall order right now. So as she hangs up the phone and she's thinking about this, her husband proposes they go for a walk in town. So they go out, and it's this beautiful, blue-black evening in spring, and it's warm and it's gorgeous out. There's a full moon. They go down to the docks near the river in their town. And as they're standing there, and she and her husband are just being quiet, they're not talking, they're just looking at the river. And the river is perfectly still. And there's a full moon in the sky, and there's a full moon on the river, reflected perfectly in the river, on the surface of the water. And as they watch the moon in silence, a breeze comes up and ruffles the surface of the river, and the moon breaks into a million pieces. But then she's kind of startled, and she looks up at the moon in the sky, and of course, it's still whole and complete and intact and radiant. And the breeze quickly dies down, and she watches the water, and then the moon kind of comes back together on the surface of the water. And she's just so enamored with this vision, this image. And all of a sudden, she remembers a haiku that she knows, and it goes like this. She shared it with her husband. It says this: broken and broken again on the wave, how easily mends the moon. And she shared this with her husband. She was so inspired by this idea, how easily mends the moon. And she realized that all that it took was calmness for that reflected image of the moon to come back together. It was the calmness that made the reflection, again, the perfect image of what was in the sky. Well, she was so thrilled with this idea. They started walking back home, and she was just completely inspired by this image, this idea. And she started to think of the shepherd, the 23rd Psalm. and how the shepherd would lead the sheep through the still waters, and how it's the stillness where the reflection happens, where the clarity is. When you look into a still pool of water, it's clear. And as she thought about that, and she was thinking about this sense of being that reflection of God, and how even though she felt like she had fragmented into this crazy state of Rash, that she was so taken with this idea of being led by the still waters and finding that clarity in her relationship to God. That what she was realizing in this moment is that as she was really looking for her understanding of her identity in divinity, like those laws we talked about, in seeing herself that way. Well, she was so eager to think about this that she went to bed that night completely with no worry and no concern. What was so astounding for her was that she had spent the whole day worrying about this thing, right? Where did it come from? Is it ever going to leave? What caused it, etc.? Is it going to get worse? But that night, all the worry and concern had gone and was replaced by this incredible story of the moon mending itself. And when she woke up the next day, there was no rash at all, and it hadn't reoccurred. And what stayed with her was that sense of how it's in the calmness where we see ourselves clearly. That sense of finding calmness in ourselves, we see ourselves clearly and we see others more clearly. So being at peace with other people. She talked about this phrase as well. She said, this is from Mary Baker Eddy, absorbed in material selfhood, we discern and reflect but faintly the substance of life or mind. Life and mind are aspects of God's being. Divine life, divine mind, divine consciousness. That if we want to reflect that sense of divinity, when we're absorbed in material selfhood, when we're thinking about our personal psychology, our personal history, we're looking at ourselves physically all the time, it's difficult to be that reflection, to feel like that reflection of divinity. And that it was when the senses were quiet that she could feel that calmness and see herself as that divine reflection. Mary Baker Eddy wrote this about a lake, actually, and I think it's really appropriate for this story. She says, stand by the limpid lake, see therein the mirrored sky and the moon ablaze with her mild glory. This will stir your heart. Then, in speechless prayer, ask God to enable you to reflect God, to become his own image and likeness, even the calm, clear, radiant reflection of Christ's glory. Isn't that beautiful? That's our goal. The mind of Christ is about reflecting Christ's glory, that each one of us has that potential to be that radiant image of the Christ like Jesus showed us. All right. This is Mary Baker Eddy. You've heard a bit about her today. She believed so much in this sense of prayer as stillness. She saw God as impartial, universal love that was available for every person. So these stories you're hearing today, that I'm sharing from my experience and my friends, this is available for anyone, even a child, to practice and to understand more about God. That there's a unity with divine presence that all of us can feel, and that just turning ourselves a little bit towards God in the middle of our day can tune us in to that unity with divine presence. All right, so we're going to finish up with part 3. How can we think about this in terms of the world, in terms of world events? And there's another part in Psalms that talks about be still and commune with your own heart upon your bed, which essentially means be still and listen to your heart, okay? So that helps us think about what's going on in the world. And I'm going to share a bird story with you. If you heard Patti's talk, we have a bird theme today. So this is a canary. It's a different bird. But I'm going to tell you a story that I heard when I was working in conflict resolution and peace building. And someone shared with me that there had been a contest for children to draw what they thought peace looked like. So the children drew all their pictures and they sent them in, and this was the winning image. It was a huge, rushing, roaring waterfall. And it was very turbulent. And if you've ever been near a waterfall, is it a very quiet place? No, right? You have to kind of shout to be heard if you're standing near the waterfall. So this rushing, turbulent waterfall was spilling over the rocks and tumbling down with all this steam coming up at the bottom. And behind the waterfall on this little ledge was a yellow canary. And the child had pictured the canary as singing. Now, what does this say to you? Why do you think this was what they chose to represent peace? Anybody have an idea? Being undisturbed, great.
It's got a song that's coming out one way or another.
The canary has a song. It's coming out one way or the other, right? It's not disturbed by what's going on in the waterfall. It's still able to sing, right? Yeah. Anything else? Anyone else wanted to? The what? It's a little bird, right? It's got a little voice, which is interesting in contrast to this huge, rushing, roaring waterfall. And I think what's key about that is that that's how sort of world events can feel, I think. Like we're this little tiny bird with this little tiny voice in this little tiny town called South Lake Tahoe or wherever you are on the web, right? And what can we do to influence what's going on in Syria, right? Or how can we influence what's happening in our government in Washington or in other, in negotiations about Iran or whatever it might be that might be coming up for us, or school shootings that are happening, in our communities here in America. Whatever the challenges might be, it can feel like we're this tiny little canary and there's this huge rushing, roaring waterfall. But what I think is key for me about this story is that the canary is still singing and it hasn't lost its voice. It's not in the waterfall. It's not being drowned by the waterfall. And I'll just share a story with you that I heard years ago from a woman who used to live in Germany during the time when Germany was divided into East and West Germany. And this is when I was in college, and the wall had come down already, and Germany was reunited. And I was talking with this woman who lived there, and she was sharing with me how she prayed every single day for 10 years for that wall to come down. And at the time, I was 20, so this was like half my life, right? Okay, so she'd been praying for 10 years, and I just couldn't fathom praying for the same thing every day for 10 years. And so I said, how could you pray that way and not see the results after 5 years or 7 years? How did you keep going? And she said, well, Laurie, the wall came down in a moment, but it wasn't the work of a moment. And she said it was the change in thought and consciousness over years that caused the wall to come down in that moment. And then she asked a question. She said, and what do you think changes consciousness? And she was talking about prayer. That her prayer, she said every day, she saw every prayer like that little voice of the canary. Maybe it felt small, but it was going out and it was chipping away at the mental walls and the mental blocks that are created in consciousness, in society. And chipping away little by little every prayer at bringing those walls down so that consciousness can evolve, societies can evolve. Every good thing that has happened in the world starts with an idea, starts in consciousness shifting and changing, and results in an action. But that's why every single prayer that we pray without cynicism, without feeling apathetic, but with a sense of aligning ourselves with that reality of spirit that we don't see with the senses, but we understand as we learn about God. Every prayer like that chips away at something that right now seems unavoidable or seems impossible. And as you heard Mary Baker Eddy, I'm going backwards, I'm sorry. I pressed the wrong button. Mary Baker Eddy, as you heard earlier, founded the Christian Science Monitor. And to me, the Christian Science Monitor represents this little canary. The goal of the Christian Science Monitor for over 100 years has been to bless all of humanity. That's the goal of the news. And to bring a little bit of conversation to the dialogue in the world that changes the conversation. And that allows us to feel like no matter how big that waterfall is, no matter how rushing it is, we don't have to jump into the middle and try to fix it. We can remain like the canary on the ledge, looking around and singing for that goodness. And that's what the Monitor has always helped me do, by starting me thinking about news stories in a different light, so that we can be that influence to break down those walls in the world. All right, so in summary, we talked about sort of being still with ourselves first, finding that practicing stillness wherever we are, in the middle of traffic, in the middle of our workday, at church, that stillness is not about emptying ourselves out and just being empty. It's really about filling ourselves up with a clarity and a sense of that vision of being at peace with ourselves. Pick one quality that we mentioned and focus on that for your day and see how your day unfolds in that way. We talked about how in conflicts with others, to have the mind of Christ means we look beyond their behavior to the way that God sees them, to what we can see about them the way Jesus saw them, to see beyond the external picture. And then we talked about how in the world that there's no prayer that goes that goes out and doesn't affect something. We may not see the effects for 10 years, which is quite a longevity, but every prayer chips away at those mental blocks that are keeping people from finding love, that are keeping people from experiencing harmony in their lives, from finding solace after an egregious loss. That every prayer has an effect, whether we see it or not, and it's worth doing. And finally, that the stillness that we're practicing, it's aligning us with that spiritual reality we talked about. Those laws that undergird our existence, that are divine laws, that we don't perceive with our physical senses, that we only perceive with our hearts. And that results in healing. So finally, we'll just end with an idea from Mary Baker Eddy today that she talks about this divine mind, a divine consciousness, and how it revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence is felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. Thank you all for joining us today and for being a great audience. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.